Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching my presentation. I am Anderson Hagler. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Duke University. Before I begin, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Dan Knorr and Erin Newton at Chicago for contributing to this panel. And I would also like to thank the American Historical Association for continuing to facilitate these asynchronous discussions during the pandemic precipitated by COVID-19. So give me just a second and I'll begin my presentation. So what exactly do I mean when I say discursive conquest, masculinity, and sodomy in 18th century New Mexico? For conquest, I am referring to more than the subjugation of Native American peoples and the seizure of their territory by military force. I'm referring to all manners of attempts to intervene in the region by assertions of dominion through legal and political jurisdiction. Discursive conquest refers to the above, as well as the notion that shifting power structures altered the political and social dynamics between Spanish colonizers and indigenous peoples, such as the Pueblo of New Mexico. So for here, you can think reactive, meandering, ongoing. So I understand that discursive has two meanings, and I'm using both of them. I'm using discourse, and I'm also using the meandering and ongoing definition of discursive when I say discursive conquest. And Spanish colonizers employed both material and discursive types of evidence to convince themselves as well as their superiors that they had achieved conquest, thus justifying their continued presence in the region. So because of this, materiality and discourse become interlaced and interconnected. Some material types of evidence might include the Spanish practice of post-mortem mutilation, whereby Spanish officers transported and then later presented ears, scalps, heads of the slain before the viceroy as proof of their military victories. Another material side of conquest is the establishment of missions in the Kingdom of New Mexico. And this represents Catholicism's supremacy in the region, as these mission complexes, function as sites of indoctrination. So again, there's that interrelationship. One is the material, but in the material is also the discourse. Religion itself enabled the Spanish to gain a foothold in the region. Following Juan de Oñate's arrival in 1598, albeit uninvited arrival, the Pueblo swore allegiance as subjects of the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church. And in so doing, they enabled the clergy to institute the religious legal category of crimes such as sodomy on the Pueblo people. And the Spanish clergy attempted to regulate indigenous sexuality by labeling their practices as bestial or against the natural law, and in some way tried to impose heteronormative practices in the frontier. Okay, so sodomy is a slightly complex topic. It isn't the exact definition that we have today. That's a very modern understanding of sodomy, and it's largely more narrow than it was in the colonial era. So what actually oftentimes, although sodomy and sodomia, that is a word, it does exist in Spanish, but lots of the records actually contain the phrase nefarious sin or pecado nefando. And so you can see that here underlined in red. If you just squint ever so slightly, you see el pecado nefando. So the nefarious sin taken from this case. Since 1947, the Catholic kings in Spain stated that any person found guilty of the nefarious sin, so sodomy, merited death by fire. So this was not a good charge, and there could be considerable repercussions, even just the accusation of being a sodomite. And now, since the occupation of Mexico by Spanish colonizers like Hernan Cortez, Spaniards used the charge of sodomy to justify conquest. They are sodomites, they're effeminate, so on and so forth. They do not respect natural law, cannibals, things like that of that nature then justifies conquest. And these colonizers are expanding on a tradition in the New World where someone charged and convicted of these crimes, such as sodomy, might lose property as well as social standing in the local community. But of course, the Spaniards were not all powerful, and I'm not trying to represent indigenous peoples as passive victims. And so for New Mexico, it is important to note that outbreaks of violence, such as the Pueblo revolts of 1680 and 1696, demonstrated that the Pueblo did not internalize Orthodox Catholicism in all aspects as Spaniards would have liked, despite the repeated attempts of evangelization in the region. In short, the Pueblo, of course, are showing their agency and demonstrating their ability to speak for themselves and to change their history of their own region, right, their own home. 1680, the revolt of 1680 was one of the most successful in Spanish colonial history from the perspective of Native Americans, as the Spaniards are forced to flee Santa Fe for 12 years, hiding out in El Paso all the while. But in 12 years later, so 1692, Don Diego de Varas comes back and symbolically claims to have reconquered the territory. And so once again, we're showing the ongoing nature, the to and fro, the meandering side of conquest. Despite having said this, I believe, and I will argue, that indigenous forms of masculinity become suspect in the eyes of Spanish colonizers as a consequence of colonization and conquest in general. So when we say the northern frontier of New Spain, that does border into what is now the modern day United States. And I am going to talk about a case from Santa Fe, New Mexico, which took place on June 25th, 1731. In this case, Manuel Trujillo, a Spanish colonizer, testifies before the authorities that he saw two indigenous men, Asensio Povilla from Nambe Pueblo and Antonio Yuga, originally from Tizuki Pueblo, committing the nefarious sin. So they are committing sodomy. Well, how does he know? He states that while roaming the countryside on horseback, let me pause for a moment and just say horseback shows Trujillo has elevated status. So while riding on horseback, Trujillo climbs a hill alongside a ravine, and he claims from this vantage point that he could easily recognize Povilla and Yuba in this act. So tropes such as barbarity and the rampant sodomy allegedly among indigenous peoples help continue to justify conquest. Having seen this crime, it would not be okay for Trujillo to sit back idly and let it happen. No, so with the reins of his bridle, Trujillo proceeds to whip Povilla and Yuba for their offense committed against God. Trujillo is not satisfied with this whipping, and so he ups the ante and then ensures that the local authorities arrest Povilla and Yuba. As an agent of Spanish colonialism, Trujillo represents the broader context of employing accusations of sodomy to control and justify dominance in the region. A colonizer such as Trujillo could exploit an accusation of sodomy to his advantage. The majority of the accused in sodomy trials suffered physical and economic consequences regardless of culpability, simply because it's such a heinous sin and crime. That Povilla and Yuba have to prove their innocence following Trujillo's accusation of sodomy places them in a subordinate position relative to Trujillo. One example in which I see some ethnocentrism coming to the fore, and where simply being indigenous or not adopting the Spanish ways of things can be seen suspect, came out in trial testimony. One of the accusations, among many others, that Trujillo issues toward Pueblo and Yuba is that they did not wear pants. This contributes to the notion that they're uncivilized, that they're half naked, and of course, this comes from the centuries or millennia long tradition of associating nudity with sin, right? After Adam and Eve get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, they have to wear clothing because they are ashamed, right? So I think this is what Trujillo was attempting when he was saying Pueblo and Yuba were not wearing pants, something along this line. Spanish legal system, although biased toward Christian ideal and ethnocentric in many ways, did at least provide defense lawyers. So there's some notion of fairness, at least, even if it doesn't pass the modern standards of fairness. So they do have a defense lawyer. So Yuba's defense lawyer's name is Juan Manuel Chirinos. He understands indigenous customs of dress differently. He makes the point that the indigenous people of that region in New Mexico typically wore mantas. So it's just simply like a garment around the waist. This then allows him to argue that although they may not have been wearing trousers, that doesn't necessarily mean they were naked. So still, there is some attempt at fairness in the overall thing. It's not entirely skewed toward one side, but I think on the whole, it tends to work out to the disadvantage of people such as the Pueblo. In this case specifically, the presiding judge, Antonio Perez Velarde, he orders a remission, but he still punishes Povilla and Yuba with exile. Velarde exiles Povilla to San Felipe Pueblo and Yuba to Zuni Pueblo for a period of 4 months. And they are not to talk to one another during this time. If they do, they could receive 200 lashes each for violating his sentence. The case does not state whether or not Povilla and Yuba own land. However, the punishment of exile forcibly removes the convicted from any land that they might have occupied. And this allows for Spaniards to begin to label the land as uncultivated or underexploited. So indigenous peoples had to maintain a continuous physical presence in order to keep their lands. Once again, we see the labels, the discourse is interlinking with materiality. Okay, frustrated conquistadors. When Spaniards don't receive the rewards they believe they deserve, resentment often comes forth. And we see this many times in many sorts of conquests. Sticking to New Mexico, the Coronado expedition did not lead to the discovery of treasures like Hernan Cortez or the Pizarro brothers, in terms of what Spaniards wanted, nor did they find a passageway to Asia. So there's a lot of frustration when things go awry and there's not a quick fix, right? You do not become millionaires overnight. So I believe that there's a potential point of conflict between local state agents and indigenous peoples who are, of course, native to these areas. Spanish colonizers desire land to elevate their socioeconomic standing. But the alienation, too much alienation of indigenous peoples, as we see with the Pueblo revolts of 1680 and then 1696, can lead to conflict. So then you have no order, right? And if there's no order of the Spanish state, then Spaniards do no longer have control over the area. So those removed, oftentimes in the capital cities, might try to assuage the indigenous peoples and might issue proclamations in favor of them and constantly chastise or remind the conquistadors to be the bigger person or the better Christian and so on and so forth. But this inevitably creates resentment among Spanish colonizers, and I think provides the interstice necessary to accuse indigenous peoples of sodomy and then enact discursive conquest, a type of conquest in which indigenous peoples' masculinity becomes suspect, as they are generally depicted as effeminate, uncivilized, or barbaric. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this presentation, considering all that's going on in the world right now. If this was interesting to you, please feel free to keep in touch. You may reach me at my website, andersonhagler.com. Send an email, anderson.hagler@duke.edu. And if any of this material has sounded interesting to you, you may consult it. I published an article in July of 2019 in Ethnohistory, and I have an article forthcoming in the Americas, which is a slightly different topic, not on sodomy, but instead on shapeshifting, idolatry, and orthodoxy. So once again, I'd like to thank the AHA and you for listening. Take care.
Hello, thank you for participating in this virtual panel. My name is Dan Knorr. I'm a member of the Faculty of History at the University of Cambridge. And I'm going to be telling you a story about the relationship between empire, masculinity, and the visual landscape in early modern China during the Qing dynasty. First, I want to introduce you to the main characters of that story: a spring, a man, two emperors, and two dead poets. First, the spring is Baotou Spring in Jinan, a provincial capital in North China. Baotou Spring has been Jinan's most famous scenic site for quite a long time, and it's one of the most famous springs in all of China. The man, Ren Hongyuan, lived in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. He was a native of Jinan, and a scholar and poet of some but not too much repute. He's best known for his compilation of Baotou Spring Gazetteer, which he completed late in his life. The two emperors are the Kangxi and Qianlong emperors, whose very long reigns effectively framed Ren Hongyuan's life. They're significant to our story in large part because of their role in reshaping the landscape of the area around Baotou Spring, depositing monuments to imperial power there, and also writing a series of poems about it on successive visits to Jinan. The two poets are both connected to Jinan and very famous, at least in China. The first one is Li Qingzhao, a woman who lived in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. And the second is a man, Li Panlong, who lived in the 16th century. Despite both of them sharing the surname Li, there's no family relationship between them. So here's what we know. Ren Hongyuan spent a lot of time compiling texts about Baotou Spring and the area around it, and even writing about it himself. And he was doing this in a period in which the landscape of Baotou Spring was changing considerably and becoming associated with imperial authority in an unprecedented way, thanks to our two emperors. As this was happening, he and his peers ensured the survival of a monument to one of our poets, Li Panlong. At the same time, that was at Baotou Spring, at the same time, he and others began a practice of writing poems that is connected Li Qingzhao to Baotou Spring. But they made no effort to honor her in such a materially visible way, and she doesn't show up in Baotou Spring Gazetteer at all. So here's my argument. The publicly visible commemoration of Li Panlong, on the one hand, entailed an accommodation between local cultural heritage dating back to the late Ming and the service that elite men owed to the Qing and its kind of imperial authority. The more hidden commemoration of Li Qingzhao, on the other hand, didn't require such a visible accommodation, and so it allowed these men to express a different sense of masculinity that reflected the virtues with which Li Qingzhao was associated: a genuine emotionality, a loss at the hands of invaders from the north, and fidelity to her deceased husband. This story shows how the complex politics of gender in early Qing China shaped engagement with the material and literary landscape, and did so in a place well beyond the spatial epicenter of the cultural angst that we associate with the southern portion of the empire in the wake of the Qing conquest. And so it expands the kind of geographic considerations in existing literature on culture in the early Qing period. So let me provide a little bit more background for our story historically. So in 1644, the Qing state, which was governed by Manchus, decisively invaded the Ming Empire, which was in the middle of falling to a series of rebellions. Some of the Chinese elites submitted to the new Manchu rulers quickly. Others put up fierce resistance, often violent. Meanwhile, others submitted passively while holding some Ming loyalist sentiments in reserve. And for the Manchu rulers then, this kind of cast a long shadow of suspicion over these elites, especially in the cultural and economic core of the empire in the lower Yangtze, where resistance to the Qing was fiercest. Meanwhile, northern elites, including in the area around Jinan, generally submitted a bit more quickly and unproblematically to Qing rule. Now, an important thing for our story is that this politics of submission versus resistance was highly gendered. In imperial China, the relationship between a minister and a ruler was imagined as analogous to that between a wife and her husband. Particularly in early modern China, when our story takes place, when a woman's husband died, the ideal was for her to remain unmarried. This was a kind of symbolic death. In fact, by the late Ming period, in the 17th century, some women actually committed suicide upon the death of their husband or even a man to whom they were betrothed. So they took this symbolic death a step further, joining them in physical death. Now, when a dynasty fell, ministers, including degree-holding elites, were supposed to at least withdraw from public life and not serve the new dynasty, a kind of political symbolic death, or in a more heroic acts, to die or commit suicide as an act of loyalty to the old dynasty and resistance to the new one. Moreover, men who survived the Qing conquest often wrote about the trauma that they themselves experienced or witnessed through the lens of women. They even went so far as to adopt women's voices and personas in writing about the sense of loss and dislocation and destruction in terms of culture and material objects and lives that were part of this period. Now, Ren Hongyuan was born after the Qing conquest, and so he didn't personally experience the moral dilemmas of that period. However, younger generations of men like Ren Hongyuan still idealized elites who had chosen to take and often die on a moral high ground during the conquest period, even though these younger generations were now bound, supposedly unproblematically, to the Qing, the new dynasty. So let's talk about our first poet, Li Panlong. Unlike Ren Hongyuan, Li Panlong lived well before the Qing conquest and died well before it too. After his death, he was commemorated at a tower built in his honor at Baotu Spring. This tower was named White Snow Tower after two residences that Li had built elsewhere during his lifetime. In fact, Li's connections to Baotu Spring itself were quite limited. It was really constructed after his death, and the site became a place to commemorate him and part of the visual landscape of Baotu Spring. White Snow Tower itself went through multiple cycles of disrepair and renovation in the late Ming and into the early Qing, but it remained a fixture in local writings about Baotu Spring, including a number collected in Baotu Spring Gazetteer. The site's history reached a kind of inflection point in 1736, when officials acting with orders from the newly ascended Qianlong Emperor carried out a major renovation of pavilions that were housed steles bearing the calligraphy of the Kangxi Emperor that he had left there in the wake of his visits to Jinan some 50 years prior. In an essay included in Baotu Spring Gazetteer, Ren Hongyuan and one of his friends described how this new construction had blocked up the entrance to White Snow Tower, which was right now kind of an ebb of, at the moment, kind of an ebb of use and disrepair. And they worried that this new kind of imperial project would wind up overshadowing White Snow Tower and send it spiraling permanently into a state of disrepair. And so with the support of local officials, they undertook their own renovation project to repair White Snow Tower, and they in fact succeeded in helping it remain a site that was important to the commemoration of Li Panlong for many years to come. And so along with Li Panlong then, White Snow Tower existing alongside these imperial monuments served as a kind of testament to the cultural legacy that Jinan's elite had inherited from the Ming. In so doing, though, this involved a very conscious material and textual, as we can see in Baotu Spring Gazetteer, accommodation to signs of imperial power. And this effectively signaled that any nostalgia that these men held for olden times was subordinated to their loyalty for the present dynasty. Now, Li Qingzhao lived nearly half a millennium before Li Panlong and was no less famous than him. However, there was no visible monument to her in Jinan until the 19th century, and none at Baotu Spring specifically until 1959. Now, the reason for that is pretty simple. Li Qingzhao's connections to Jinan and even more Baotu Spring specifically were even more tenuous than Li Panlong's. Li Panlong was a native of Jinan. Li Qingzhao's family came from a town nearby but in a different county. It's very plausible that during her childhood she spent some amount of time in Jinan, and she may even have been born there too, although that's, subject of some debate. In any case, Li Qingzhao is much better known for her later life. After she was married to scholar official Jia Mingcheng, they spent time in other parts of the province. And then, in the wake of an invasion by the Jurchen Jin dynasty that seized the northern portions of the Song dynasty, which Jia Mingcheng and Li Qingzhao lived under, both of them, along with many others, were forced to flee their homes in the north for the south. Shortly after their flight, Jia Mingcheng died, and ending the happy marriage that he had enjoyed with Li Qingzhao, which involved a shared interest in collecting carved inscriptions. And Li Qingzhao was left widowed and without a steady source of income, and trying to hold together as much of the family's treasured possessions as she was able to. And so she cut this kind of famously tragic figure with this whole kind of rich range of associations. And these associations then took on new significance in the wake of the Qing conquest, as elite men tried to grapple with how their lives and the culture they were familiar with had been upended again by northern invaders, physical dislocation, destruction on multiple levels, and even more as they turned towards female voices to try to make sense and work out their feelings about these things. Now, again, there aren't any references to Li Qingzhao in Baotu Spring Gazetteer or physically at the spring itself in the time period that Ren Hongyuan was living. However, there is this tradition of poetry associating her to Baotu Spring that springs up right around this period and that Ren Hongyuan was involved in. The signs of these are a couple of poems that first appear in a 1778 County Gazetteer. One poem there that's written by a local poet, Tian Wen, who came from the nearby city of Dezhou. And then in the 1926 County Gazetteer, there's a poem by Ren Hongyuan himself. And then a number of other poems that build on this theme that seem to have been written later. So Ren Hongyuan seems to be part of this trend that starts in the late 17th, maybe the early 18th century, of writing poetry about Li Qingzhao and her supposed associations with Baotu Spring, specifically this idea that her family had a residence at the site. So let's take a look at these poems. The themes that we find there aren't entirely surprising. Both associate Li Qingzhao with distance from the narrator, the poet, as well as feelings of loss and dislocation. Tianwen's poem in particular plays with the narrator's affinity for her as a personage and the distance of the narrator from her. So we find the narrator going to the site, looking for Li Qingzhao's former house, and finding it, shrouded by poplar trees, or less literally, not finding any trace of it all, just the trees covering where it may have once stood. We also see this evocative image of a bird flying, taking off and flying for the south, and thus eluding the narrator who comes to the site. And the bird also strikes a kind of perfect image of a widowed Li Qingzhao fleeing for the south by herself. However, in kind of this sense of distance that gets emphasized, the poet comes close, ironically, to his perceived and idealized emotional state of Li Qingzhao, that she's someone who's lonely, who's separated from the people she loves. And so in kind of feeling this distance through this encounter with a place that's supposed to be associated with Li Qingzhao, even though the poet doesn't find her there, he actually kind of comes into this more intimate emotional communion with her, which speaks to the potency of this site in relationship to her memory. Ren Hongyuan's poem also reflects these themes of distance, but also gives us a sense of Li Qingzhao's legacy living on in various ways. So the third and fourth lines juxtapose the fragility of flowers in the autumn with their rejuvenation in the spring. Note in the fourth line, this reference to Shu Yu has a double meaning. On the one hand, Shu Yu was another spring that was located in the very close proximity to both Baotu Spring itself and Liushu Spring, which is supposed to be the closest spring to Li Qingzhao's residence. There's a whole group of springs around Baotu Spring. But Shu Yu was also the name of one of Li Qingzhao's poetry collections. The final lines likewise juxtapose the transience of Li Qingzhao's literary skill and her romantic feelings for Zhao Mingcheng with her the continued fame of her lyric poetry. Now, in the fifth line, we see a reference to Li Qingzhao's reputed love for collecting inscriptions, but we also see a parallel there to Ren Hongyuan's role as a kind of collector of texts about Baotu Spring. This poem's juxtaposition of decay and loss on one hand, and preservation and revival on the other, echoes how literati like Ren Hongyuan, in compiling Baotu Spring Gazetteer, meditated on the irreparable nature of the material and cultural destruction that was associated with the Qing conquest, even while they were still endeavoring through a variety of means, and well after the conquest itself, to kind of preserve and piece back together memories of what they saw as a late Ming heyday of literary culture. This phrase "feng liu" in the seventh line is especially evocative of the romanticism that was associated with the late Ming. It also speaks to, in this kind of reference to Li Qingzhao's biography and her purported, romantic relationship, marriage with Zhao Mingcheng, also speaks to a kind of a refashioning of Li Qingzhao's biography in the early modern period. Now, historically, after her husband had died, Li Qingzhao remarried. This wasn't especially controversial back in the 12th century when it happened. However, over the next several hundred years, this ideal of widow chastity developed to a much greater extent. And so by the late Ming and early Qing, the fact that Li Qingzhao had remarried after her husband's death contravened this image of her as kind of the ideal heroine. The solution that became increasingly common by the time that Ren Hongyuan was alive was to simply deny that Li Qingzhao had remarried and that this was a story that was cooked up by people who didn't like her in order to defame her. And so, in effect, what we see in both poems, and here especially in the last lines of Ren Hongyuan's poem, is a playing up of the idealized image of Li Qingzhao's femininity in order to evoke a sense of absolute loyalty and loss. She had this deep, unwavering connection to Jia Mingcheng that she never betrayed. Both poems, I would argue, are also involved in performing a kind of composite masculinity. One side of the masculinity that we see in the engagement with the visual landscape of Baotu Spring is publicly appropriate and visible. And we see that in this reconciliation between Li Panlong and the Ming cultural legacy on one hand, with the imperial splendor of the Qing on the other. However, the other side of this composite masculinity that we see in these poems about Li Qingzhao is more hidden, both left out of the pages of Baotu Spring Gazetteer and out of the physical landscape of Baotu Spring. This means that there isn't any necessary reconciliation between these sentiments and imperial authority, and helps preserve her as an uncompromised and ideal heroine. Now, for men to aspire to the ideal of Li Qingzhao meant that they identified with a kind of moral heroism that wasn't available to them personally because the conquest had already happened, and now this Qing dynasty demanded their absolute loyalty. The claim that Ren Hongyuan and others were making, though, was that their gendered political subjectivities weren't determined solely by the present dynasty, but by a spiritual connection to the past that was embodied in their affinity for a woman who, to them, symbolized the loss of a husband and a dynasty, and loyal resistance to remarriage and foreign conquerors. Now, this sense of composite masculinity and its relationship to the state is very different from modern political subjectivity. Qing imperial legitimacy hinged on the idea that it had inherited the right to rule from the previous dynasty, from the Ming, which had lost that right by its own misgovernance. This, though, necessarily entailed the possibility that the Qing would fall. And so the kind of preparation that we see Ren Hongyuan and others making by associating themselves with Li Qingzhao for making a kind of ultimate sacrifice on behalf of the state isn't entirely subversive. This is very different from nationalist ideology, which treats the relationship between the subject and nation as primordial and immortal. The sense is that people today are loyal to the nation in just the same way as people hundreds of years ago were loyal to that same nation. There's no sense of dynastic turnover. Instead, there's a flattening of history. So unlike imperial history, nationalist history subsumes all of these histories into the meta-narrative of which the nation is the subject. This means then that there's no positive use from the nation's perspective in leaving some of these histories hidden, in the way that there was a particular use for Ren Hongyuan and others in leaving Li Qingzhao hidden in different ways. If you visit Baotu Spring today, you will in fact see this process of subsumation at work. Now a monument to Li Qingzhao is a centerpiece of the park at Baotu Spring, and it sits unproblematically beside both the steles left by the Kangxi and Qianlong emperors and the reconstructed White Snow Tower honoring Li Panlong. The irony, of course, is that Li Qingzhao only occupies such a visible place in this landscape because literati like Ren Hongyuan, for whom her value lay in keeping her hidden, first placed her there at Baotu Spring and associated her with the site.
Thank you for choosing to watch this recorded presentation for the American Historical Association's 2021 annual meeting. And thank you to my fellow panelists, Dan and Anderson, for including me in this presentation. My name is Erin Newton, and I am a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at the University of Chicago. My dissertation, tentatively titled Touch, Care, Nurse, Gender, Nursing Education, and Care Ethics in 20th Century Japan, focuses on nursing and nursing education over the long 20th century, with a particular focus on the sensory experience of touch as a framework for understanding the fundamental ways in which touch has shaped the experience of medicine for both practitioners and patients in different ways throughout a rapidly evolving definition of the medical encounter. Today, however, I will be presenting an early part of my graduate school work, Mentality and Masculinity in Crisis, Soldiers' Sickbed Diaries During the Asia-Pacific War, 1937 to 1945. This is part of an article-length paper I am currently in the process of revising for publication, so your thoughts and comments would be greatly appreciated. My stomach's condition is better, and I eat about half of my meals. Although my body feels healthier, my heart is restless. When will I return? Patient WN084. I cannot hear and I cannot speak, but that my head cannot think is truly sad. I am no good anymore. I do not want to wait to die. Patient WN123. Writing in the early part of 1940, these two soldiers were patients at Konodai Army Hospital over the same period of time, both being treated for mental disorders using psychiatric practices and therapies. From these excerpts, however, it is clear that the two had very different perspectives on their conditions and prognosis for the future. The first patient, whom we shall refer to as patient WN084, was eagerly anticipating his recovery and the prospect of rejoining his squad in China. Patient WN123, on the other hand, seems to have already given up and resigned himself not just to illness, but also to death. The mental disorders that had resulted in their hospitalization were not rare in wartime Japan. These men were two of the thousands of soldiers treated for similar mental disorders using the available psychiatric practices and medicines between 1937 and 1945. Within a year, both men, like many of those treated at Konodai, were eventually given a medical discharge from the army and sent home. Attempts to treat their illnesses had failed to restore them to combat readiness. The medical records collected from Konodai Army Hospital, from which these two excerpts originate, offer a glimpse into the world of the Japanese mental hospital during the Second World War. The value of such records is incalculable. Many such documents were burned in the wake of Japan's surrender, and very few have survived to this day. Even more significantly, these records detail the conditions of soldiers in the Imperial Army who were removed from combat due to the emergence of symptoms of mental disorders. Almost all of these men were eventually given medical discharge due to either the severity of their condition or the unwillingness to place such men with demonstrated mental vulnerabilities, back into combat. This presentation uses wounded soldiers' sickbed diaries as a means for understanding constructs of mental illness and masculinity among soldiers in wartime Japan. The transformation of men into soldiers involved the construction of masculinity based on physical health and made the body of the soldier a tool of the nation and protector of the national body. Thus, illness and injury of all types demonstrated that the very embodiment of the nation was vulnerable. This was not only anathema to the image of the soldier, but also harmful to the constructed nature of that image, especially as it was internalized by individuals. As soldiers grappled with the symptoms of mental and physical injury, they were also part of a larger crisis of masculinity, and thus a crisis of the nation. In order to examine these constructions, I make use of medical records published in the 2007 Shiryo Shusei, entitled Seishin to Shougaisha from Konodai Army Hospital, located in current-day Ichikawa City in Chiba Prefecture. Opened in 1937, Konodai was the first military psychiatric department within the Japanese Empire. The Konodai records are comprised of 834 patient files compiled during the years of the Asia-Pacific War, including treatment notes and, in some cases, personal letters and notes written by the patients themselves. The inclusion of these personal perspectives offers the opportunity to establish an individual narrative of mental illness that privileges patients rather than psychiatrists. It has been estimated that more than 10,000 soldiers were either seen or treated at the Army Hospital in between 1938 and 1945. Though the information contained in these documents is immense, it is important to remember that the published records represent a small portion of the reality of wartime Japan. Somehow, my head still feels sluggish and languid. I'm sleeping better at night, but occasionally when my thoughts are rambling, instead of sleeping, I consider things that are halfway done. Yesterday, I thought about the folktale of Taro Ushima and why he became an old man after opening the treasure box. That's when my answer-seeking heart was awakened, and I concluded to try to find my own divine purpose. I think it is a deep and meaningful story. I always quickly defend myself against the things the doctor says. Please try to get better quickly each day, he says. But it is like I am being hunted. Since I have relapsed in my condition, I don't seem to get any better, but I look forward to the day when I will leave here and find my true place in the world. Patient WN084. My analysis focuses specifically on those records that contain such personal recollections and accounts, such as the one you see here, written by patient 084. In these two excerpts, the soldier seems to be writing as much for his own benefit as for the doctors and psychiatrists attempting to treat him. He was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia. This patient, who was around 25 years old at the time of his admittance, had a relatively long period of hospitalization at Kolonodai, a little over a year compared to the average of 6.5 months. This suggests that the management of his diagnosis was troublesome for both the patient and the psychiatrists, a fact which is supported by the sheer volume of treatment notes accompanying 084's file, which is much more than other patient files. The mental disorder he was diagnosed with was too severe to permit him to remain in the army, and he was eventually discharged. Within the broader scope of the document collection, however, it is possible to see how certain illness categories were used by psychiatrists and doctors at Konodai Hospital during this time. In a survey of the medical records that have been made available, there are a number of disorders that resurfaced throughout the war. This chart details the common diagnostic categories that appear in these files. By far, the most common diagnoses were mania and manic disorders, which were characterized by an irregular heartbeat, speech and motor paralysis, swelling of the extremities, stomach pains, and other somatic symptoms with no discernible cause. While the name manic suggests that the disorder is similar to manic episodes suffered by those with bipolar disorder or manic depression, the term is more closely associated with hysteria, which also features prominently in the Konodai records. The primary distinction between these two terms is that the onset of hysteria was often linked to a traumatic incident. Manic disorder, by comparison, was often considered hereditary. Psychogenic depression and dissociative episodes, including psychosis, were also fairly common, but they also placed the origin of the mental disorder within the control of the individual, the soldier. This is why I believe the term construction of illness is important to this context. It is not to deny that there was an illness or disorder, but to demonstrate that there was a careful and intentional choice being made when it came to soldiers under the Japanese Empire. It was more important to attribute mental disorders to personal failing or weakness, which avoided the attribution of these disorders to mental or physical battlefield trauma, which could be linked to fault by the head of the national body for placing healthy soldiers in conditions that resulted in illness beyond what could be reasonably expected. Accounts written by doctors employed at Konodai and other military hospitals during this time have indicated that this refusal to place blame for illness on battlefield conditions was a direct order to avoid mentioning the deteriorating morale on the battlefront, as well as a wish to avoid implicating that there was something unseen that could penetrate the defenses of the masculine military body. For this reason, terms such as war neurosis, or modern-day PTSD, did not figure prominently in these diagnostic fields, and when they did appear, they were often mitigated by such factors as the patient's diet, which was more or less under his control, or physical trauma incurred at the hands of the enemy, the fault of a generalized but always antagonistic enemy combatant. In order to protect the nation, the military and all of its composite individuals needed to be perceived as impervious, stalwart in their defense of the Japanese Empire. Bias due to political pressure aside, the naming of disorders was important to the construction of mental illness. It allowed for the soldier to be classified as afflicted with a particular illness, which then allowed for that soldier to be treated with a prescribed course of action. As opposed to physical afflictions suffered during wartime, either physical injury or diseases such as tuberculosis, mental disorders presented with variable symptoms, or in some cases, few physical symptoms, making them difficult to track and trace. By giving these disorders names and distinctive links to environmental and genetic causes, mental illness was constructed as something that could be pruned from the military, much as one might remove diseased leaves from a tree. I thought that if I could just rest for a month, I would return to my unit, but then I was sent on to Qingdao and then on to Hiroshima. From Hiroshima Army Hospital, when I arrived at Nagoya Army Hospital, at the time I got off at Nagoya Station, I regretfully had to give up my military sword to an officer. I don't understand the reason why. It is probably just sitting there at the train station. If only I could retrieve it. Written during his treatment at Konodai Army Hospital, patient WN054 seemed to recall two primary concerns at the time of his disability. His initial reaction upon hearing the diagnosis of a neurasthenic episode was an anxiety for his own well-being, to get the rest and care he needed so that he would be able to return to his unit as soon as possible. His second concern seems to be over the loss of his military-issue sword, which he was made to surrender to a higher-ranked officer upon his hospitalization. The reason for this was still unclear to him at the time of writing, and the loss of the sword seems to have genuinely distressed him. Patient WN054 was eventually discharged from the Army and sent home. Military masculinity, which I define as a masculinity performed within the homosocial sphere of the military, and in this case particularly the Army, was performed by soldiers such as WN054, both consciously and unconsciously, but it was, at its most basic, an intentionally constructed institutional level masculinity. All of the soldiers who were treated at Konodai Army Hospital were conscripted through the national system. They were all subjected to the same forms of training and indoctrinated into a military body whose primary service was to the greater national body of the Japanese Empire and to the emperor specifically. The soldiers in this army were supposed to represent the best of the young men Japan had to offer, not only an example of superlative health, but also of masculinity. Japan's universal conscription system made service in either the Army or the Navy a requirement of every able-bodied Japanese man. From 1873 onward, all Japanese males aged 20 years or older were required to report each year for physical and mental examinations. Based on the results of these examinations, soldiers were classified into one of 5 groups, A through E. Category A, which featured men that were at least 1.55 meters tall and in peak mental and physical fitness. Category B and Category C were all considered fit for service. In years of peacetime, this typically only amounted to around 120,000 of the 750,000 or so men examined each year. The rest of the men in Category A, along with those in B and C, were made to complete 120 basic training hours and serve in the reserve force for at least 2 years. This system of sorting men into classes based upon physical and mental health made clear the priority of having young, healthy men embody the fighting spirit of the nation. In addition, the training process for both military conscripts and reservists was heavily regimented, including moral components such as regular readings of the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, as well as the mandatory writing of personal journals, which were then read and commented on by superior officers. Through such activities, shared by all of the men within a troop and across the imperial army, a sense of the soldier's role as part of a national body was formed. Discipline was strict within the barracks, enforced by superior officers living alongside foot soldiers and constantly criticizing their execution of drills as well as conduct. For most young soldiers, this kind of discipline was harsh, but the potential for advancement and achievement was also present. Promotion within the ranks occurred regularly, and once a soldier was put in charge of the next wave of conscripts, he was expected to be just as strict with these young men as his superiors had once been with him. Administratively, the Army's interest in the health of its soldiers went beyond their initial conscript and induction. After their name was drawn from the lottery of eligible recruits, men who were selected for service reported for a second physical before entering basic training. Both the Army and the Navy conducted routine physicals that sought to identify physiological and mental abnormalities such as tuberculosis, venereal diseases, hysteria, and neurasthenia. In close confines, such as in military barracks or on the battlefield, physical illness could spread rapidly among soldiers, reducing the healthy military body to one that was sickly and easily defeated. Japanese soldiers were supposed to reflect the highest physical ideals for the country. The soldiers of the Japanese Imperial Army were healthy, strong, free of diseases, and in the face of battle, they were supposed to be stoic defenders of the rights and rule of the national body. Since a military masculinity was very much a physical masculinity, mental disorders posed a particularly difficult challenge for the soldiers who received this diagnosis, as the wounds were not necessarily visible to either themselves or others. However, when soldiers such as WN-054 were afflicted with illnesses that presented few physical symptoms treatable in battlefield conditions, they also raised a question of how to prevent such illnesses from occurring. If the problem was present in the very experience of being a soldier, of being sent abroad to fight for the empire, then what was the solution? In order to avoid such associations, the only recourse was to remove the individual soldier from combat, marking them with a medical discharge as vulnerable, the antithesis of masculinity upheld by the healthy modern military. A re-examination of the concerns of WN-054, as written in his personal note, demonstrates how deeply ingrained this masculinity was. His preoccupation with his sword is in particular striking. At approximately 26 years of age, the possession of a military sword and the relatively frequent usage of Chinese characters support the assumption that WN-054 was most likely an officer. Despite the fact that such a sword would have had a rather humble and distinctly modern origin, it was clearly valued by the patient, as evidenced by his concern as to the current whereabouts of the sword, as well as his vow to retrieve it. Hospitalized, removed from his position within the military, and facing an indeterminate length of recovery, it is revealing that a sword, of all of his possible possessions, seems to have caused him the most concern. If the diagnosis of a mental disorder was already emasculating, having the powerful metaphorical reminder of his military service removed from him was even certainly more so. Soldiers' diaries from the Asia-Pacific War have yielded some of the best preserved accounts of life in the service of the Japanese Imperial Army. The patient notes contained within the Konodai Army Hospital document collection not only add to this rich source base, but they also provide information about the ways that soldiers made sense of mental disorders sustained as a result of combat. However, there is much more that can be done with sources such as these. For instance, given the privacy restrictions which prevent the publication of information such as patient names, birth dates, and hometowns, it is impossible to link these illnesses to factors such as age or natal environment. However, as the birth year of each patient can be clearly seen, it is possible to further this analysis through a breakdown of illnesses within certain age groups, which would provide information about how illnesses were linked to perceptions of physical and emotional development. Within the original records, which have been maintained by the compiler of the document collection, it may also be possible to see whether there is a link between incidences of disorders and certain locales within the nation. Finally, with the comparison of medical practices and perceptions of the immediate post-war period, it might be possible to see how these illnesses were constructed differently under the occupation of Japan. These and other investigations into the content of these records will add to our understanding of not only gender under empire, but also the history of mental health care and its relationship to the modern nation. Thank you for listening to this presentation. If you have any comments or questions about the presentation or my research more broadly, I welcome your emails at the email address listed below.